The bitter chill of the Montana winter cut through Jane Jenkins's thin shawl as she stood in the crowded trading post, clutching her last possession of value, a hand-woven blanket her mother had made for her wedding day 7 years prior. Her trembling fingers traced the intricate pattern one final time, knowing that selling it meant surrendering the last physical connection to her former life. But the hollow ache in her son's stomach left her no choice. Montana Territory, 1876. The unforgiving landscape had claimed many lives, including that of Jane's husband Thomas, just 3 months ago. The mining accident had left her a widow at 26 with a 5-year-old son to feed, and a harsh winter bearing down on their small cabin. The meager savings Thomas had put aside had dwindled to nothing, and the last of their food stores had been depleted that morning. "Madam, are you selling that blanket or just holding up my counter space?" The shopkeeper's impatient voice cut through Jane's thoughts. His jowly face showed no sympathy for her situation, only the calculating look of a businessman who saw another desperate settler. Jane swallowed hard. "Yes, I'm selling it. It's fine wool, hand-woven. Worth at least $5. The shopkeeper snorted. $3 is the best I can do. Times are hard for everyone." "Please," Jane whispered, her pride crumbling. "My son hasn't eaten properly in days. I need enough for food and coal." $3. Take it or leave it." The shopkeeper turned his attention to another customer, dismissing her plea. Jane's vision blurred with tears she refused to shed. $3 would barely last a week. After that, she couldn't imagine what would become of them. She thought of little Samuel waiting at Mrs. Peterson's, probably wondering when his mother would return with food. Her fingers tightened around the blanket. "I'll give you 20 for it." The deep voice came from behind her, causing Jane to turn sharply. A tall man stood there, his broad shoulders dusted with snow, dark eyes fixed on the blanket in her hands. His face was partially hidden beneath the shadow of his hat brim, but she could see a strong jaw covered with several days' worth of stubble. $20? The shopkeeper's tone changed instantly. "Now, that's mighty generous, Mr. Morgan." Jane stared in disbelief at the stranger. $20 was a small fortune enough to keep them fed for over a month. "I wasn't talking to you, Higgins," the man said, his eyes never leaving Jane's face. "I'm making the lady an offer." Jane clutched the blanket tighter. "Why would you pay so much for an old blanket?" The stranger, Morgan, the shopkeeper, had called him, removed his hat, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. "My reasons are my own, madam. Do we have a deal?" There was something in his eyes that gave Jane pause. Not pity, which she had grown to despise, but something else, something she couldn't name. But $20 meant survival, and she couldn't afford to question good fortune. "Yes," she finally said. "We have a deal." The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a fold of bills, counting out $20 and placing them in her palm. His fingers were rough with calluses, but warm against her cold skin. Jane carefully folded the bills and tucked them into her pocket, then held out the blanket with trembling hands. To her surprise, the stranger didn't take it. Instead, he shook his head. "Keep it." "But," Jane began, confused. "You need it more than I do," he said simply. The shopkeeper let out an annoyed huff. "That's not how business works, Morgan." The stranger turned, fixing the shopkeeper with a hard look that silenced him immediately. When he turned back to Jane, his expression softened. "Madam, if you don't mind me saying, you look about ready to freeze. Let me help you get your supplies, and then I'll see you safely home." Pride made Jane want to refuse, but practicality won out. "Thank you, Mr. Morgan." "Flynn," he corrected. "Flynn Morgan." Jane nodded, adjusting her shawl. "Jane Jenkins." Flynn helped Jane gather supplies, flour, beans, salt pork, coffee, sugar, and enough coal to last through the next few weeks. He carried the heavy parcels outside to where his horse waited, securing them to the saddle. "Where's your wagon?" he asked, looking around the hitching posts. Jane lowered her gaze. "I walked." Flynn's eyebrows rose. "From where?" "Our cabin. It's about 3 miles north of town." Flynn's expression darkened. "You walked 3 miles in this cold?" "I had no choice," Jane said simply. Without another word, Flynn lifted Jane onto his horse, then mounted behind her. The sudden proximity to this stranger made Jane stiffen, but the warmth radiating from his body and the solid strength of his chest against her back provided a comfort she hadn't felt in months. "I need to collect my son from Mrs. Peterson's first," Jane said, as Flynn guided the horse down the main street. Flynn nodded, and they rode in silence to a small house at the edge of town. Jane slipped down from the horse and returned moments later with a small boy bundled in a threadbare coat, his large eyes taking in Flynn with cautious curiosity. "Samuel, this is Mr. Morgan. He's going to help us get home." Flynn tipped his hat to the boy. "Pleased to meet you, Samuel." The boy said nothing, but allowed himself to be lifted up in front of Flynn while Jane settled behind. The three of them rode through the gathering dusk, the snow falling more heavily now. Jane directed Flynn through the forest trail that led to her cabin. When they arrived, Flynn helped Jane and Samuel inside before unloading the supplies. The cabin was desperately cold, with only the faintest embers glowing in the small fireplace. Flynn immediately set to work building up the fire, while Jane put away the provisions. Samuel watched Flynn from the corner, his small face serious. "Are you a real cowboy?" he finally asked. Flynn smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "I suppose I am. I work cattle at the Triple M Ranch about 10 miles west of here." "My pa worked in the mines," Samuel said proudly, "but he's in heaven now." Jane felt her throat tighten as Flynn's eyes met hers over Samuel's head. "Your pa must have been a brave man," Flynn said gently. Once the fire was blazing and the cabin began to warm, Flynn moved toward the door. "I should be on my way. The snow's getting worse." Jane followed him to the threshold, the precious $20 still secure in her pocket. "Mr. Morgan Flynn, I don't know how to thank you." Flynn settled his hat back on his head. "No need for thanks." "Mrs. Jenkins?" "Jane," she corrected. "Jane." He hesitated, then added, "I'll check on you in a few days. Make sure you're getting along all right." Before Jane could respond, Flynn was gone, disappearing into the swirling snow. She stood in the doorway watching until she could no longer see his silhouette, wondering about the strange man who had given them a lifeline when they needed it most. True to his word, Flynn returned 3 days later. The snow had stopped, but the temperature had dropped further, creating a crystalline landscape that glittered dangerously in the pale winter sun. Jane was splitting wood when she heard the approach of his horse. "You shouldn't be doing that," Flynn called as he dismounted. Jane straightened, pushing a strand of auburn hair from her face. "And who should be doing it instead?" Flynn took the axe from her hands. "Someone who hasn't been sick recently." Jane's eyes widened. "How did you—" "Your cough. I heard it the other night," Flynn explained, expertly splitting a log with one powerful stroke. "And your boy told me you've been unwell." Jane sighed. Samuel had always been too honest for his own good. "It was just a winter chill." "I'm better now." Flynn said nothing but continued chopping wood until there was a sizable pile. Jane invited him inside for coffee, which he accepted with a nod. Samuel was delighted to see Flynn again and peppered him with questions about life as a cowboy. Flynn answered with patience, describing the cattle drives and the wide open spaces with such vividness that even Jane found herself captivated. "Why aren't you at the ranch now?" Jane asked as she poured more coffee. Flynn's expression became guarded. "The ranch reduces staff during winter. I'll go back in the spring." Jane sensed there was more to the story, but didn't press. They all had their secrets. After that day, Flynn became a regular visitor. He would arrive every few days with small gifts, a rabbit he'd trapped, fresh venison, once even a jar of honey that made Samuel's eyes light up with joy. Each time, he would help with chores that Jane struggled with, fix things around the cabin, and spend time teaching Samuel about tracking animals and tying knots. Jane found herself looking forward to Flynn's visits more than she cared to admit. There was something comforting about his steady presence, his quiet strength. He rarely spoke about himself, deflecting personal questions with practiced ease. But Jane began to piece together his story from the fragments he did share. Flynn had come west after the war, working his way through various ranches before settling at the Triple M 5 years ago. He had no family that he spoke of, and the way his eyes shadowed when the topic arose told Jane there were wounds there that hadn't healed. As January gave way to February, Jane noticed a subtle shift in their interactions. Flynn's gaze lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking. His hand would brush hers when passing a cup or plate, and the brief contact would send an unexpected warmth through her. Jane told herself it was nothing, just her loneliness, making her imagine things that weren't there. One evening, as Flynn prepared to leave after supper, Samuel came running with the treasured blanket in his arms. "Take it, Mr. Flynn. It's cold outside." Flynn knelt to the boy's level. "That's your mama's special blanket, Samuel. I couldn't take that." "But you gave it back to us," Samuel insisted. "Mama told me." Flynn's eyes met Jane's over Samuel's head. She hadn't realized her son had overheard that conversation. "It's all right, Samuel," Jane said gently. "Mr. Morgan has a warm coat." Flynn ruffled Samuel's hair. "Tell you what, partner, I'll take a different favor instead. How about you draw me a picture of that wolf we saw tracks from last week?" Samuel nodded eagerly and ran to get his charcoal stub and a piece of paper Jane had saved for his drawings. When he was occupied, Flynn turned to Jane. "You told him about the blanket?" Jane shook her head. "Not everything, just that you'd been kind to us." Flynn stepped closer, his voice low. "Jane, I didn't do it to be kind. I did it because I couldn't stand seeing you suffer." The intensity in his eyes made Jane's breath catch. For a moment, she thought he might say more, might even reach for her. But then Samuel returned with his drawing, and the moment passed. After Flynn left, Jane stood at the window watching his figure disappear into the darkness, the familiar ache of loneliness tempered now by something new, a fluttering anticipation of his return. The next morning brought a change in the weather. A warm wind blew in from the south, beginning the slow process of thawing the frozen landscape. Jane opened the cabin door and stood for a moment, breathing in the promise of spring. Samuel raced outside, laughing as he scooped up the softening snow and tossed it into the air. "Mama, can we go to town today? Please?" Jane considered the request. Their supplies were holding up well thanks to Flynn's contributions, but she needed thread to mend Samuel's clothes, and the walk would do them both good after being confined for so long. "All right," she agreed, "but we'll need to be back before dark." They set out mid-morning, Samuel skipping ahead, and Jane following with a lighter heart than she'd had in months. The path to town was muddy in places where the snow had melted, but the sun on her face felt like a benediction after the long, dark winter. The town was bustling with others who had seized the opportunity to venture out. Jane purchased thread at the general store, carefully counting out coins from her dwindling supply of the $20 Flynn had given her. As she waited for her purchase to be wrapped, she overheard two men talking near the counter. "Triple M's in trouble, from what I hear," one man said. "Old Man Miller's son is running it into the ground with his gambling." "Heard they're selling off parcels to cover debts," the other replied. Shame was one of the best-run outfits in the territory. Jane's ears perked up at the mention of the Triple M Flynn's ranch. She hadn't seen him in 3 days, which was unusual. Now she wondered if these problems at the ranch were keeping him away. As she and Samuel headed home, Jane's thoughts kept returning to Flynn. She had come to rely on his visits, not just for the practical help he provided, but for the companionship. The way his rare smile transformed his face, the gentle way he spoke to Samuel, the feeling of safety she had in his presence. They were nearly home when Samuel spotted the smoke. "Mama, look, someone's at our house." Jane's heart leaped into her throat. Smoke was indeed rising from their chimney, though she'd banked the fire before they left. She grabbed Samuel's hand and hurried the last quarter-mile to the cabin. The door was ajar when they arrived. Jane pushed Samuel behind her and cautiously stepped inside, ready to confront whoever had invaded their home. She found Flynn kneeling by the fireplace, stoking the flames. He looked up at their entrance, his face breaking into a relieved smile. "There you are. I was starting to worry." Jane's fear transformed into annoyance. "You nearly frightened us to death. What are you doing here?" Flynn stood, brushing off his hands. "I brought you something." He gestured to the table, where a small crate sat. Samuel darted around Jane and peered into the crate. "Chickens!" he exclaimed. Inside were 3 hens, clucking softly. Jane stared in disbelief. "Flynn, I can't accept—" "You can and you will," Flynn interrupted firmly. "They're laying hens. They'll give you eggs, and you can sell the extras in town come summer." Jane approached the crate, running a finger over one hen's soft feathers. "How did you know I've been wanting chickens?" "You mentioned it once, said your husband had promised to build a coop come spring." Flynn hesitated. "I took the liberty of starting one out back. It's not finished yet." Jane felt tears prick her eyes at this thoughtfulness. "Thank you." Flynn nodded, seemingly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "I can't stay today. There's trouble at the ranch." "I heard in town," Jane said. "Something about debts?" Flynn's expression tightened. "Young Miller's been gambling away the ranch's profits. The hands haven't been paid in 2 months. Most have already left." "But not you," Jane observed. "I've got nowhere else to be," Flynn said with a shrug that didn't quite hide the tension in his shoulders. Jane knew there was more to it than that. "When will I see you again?" Flynn hesitated. "I don't know. Things are complicated right now." Jane felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Flynn, if you need help—" "I don't," he cut her off, more sharply than he'd ever spoken to her. Immediately regret crossed his face. "I'm sorry, Jane. I didn't mean to snap. It's just been a difficult few days." Before Jane could respond, Samuel tugged at Flynn's sleeve. "Will you still teach me to fish when it gets warmer? You promised." Flynn knelt to the boy's level, his expression softening. "I always keep my promises, Samuel. We'll go fishing as soon as the creek thaws." After Flynn left, Jane found herself standing at the window again, watching him ride away with a sense of foreboding. Something had changed, and she feared it wasn't for the better. A week passed with no sign of Flynn. Jane finished the chicken coop he had started and settled the hens into their new home. Samuel collected the first egg with such excitement that Jane wished Flynn had been there to see it. As the days lengthened and more snow melted, Jane began preparing a small plot for a vegetable garden. The work was hard, turning the soil that had been frozen for months, but it gave her purpose and kept her mind from dwelling too much on Flynn's absence. It was during one of these afternoons of digging that she heard a horse approaching. Her heart lifted, expecting to see Flynn, but instead, a stranger rode into the clearing. He was expensively dressed, with a watch chain glinting across his vest and boots polished to a high shine. "Mrs. Jenkins?" he called, removing his hat. Jane straightened, wary. "Yes?" "James Miller," he introduced himself. "I own the Triple M Ranch." Jane's grip tightened on her shovel. This was the gambling son she'd heard about Flynn's employer. "What can I do for you, Mr. Miller?" Miller dismounted, his movements showing he was more accustomed to town life than ranching. "I believe you're acquainted with one of my hands, Flynn Morgan." Jane nodded cautiously. "He's been kind enough to help us through the winter." Miller's lips curled in what might have been a smile. "Yes, I imagine he has. Morgan's always had a soft spot for charity cases." The insult stung, but Jane kept her expression neutral. "Did you need something, Mr. Miller?" "Information, Mrs. Jenkins. Morgan disappeared 3 days ago, taking a rather valuable horse with him. I thought perhaps he might have mentioned where he was headed." Alarm shot through Jane. Flynn was gone, and being accused of theft? "Mr. Morgan hasn't been here in over a week," she said truthfully, "and he doesn't strike me as a thief." Miller's smile didn't reach his eyes. "No? Well, appearances can be deceiving. If he should contact you, I'd appreciate you letting me know immediately. There's a reward for information." "I'll keep that in mind," Jane said stiffly. Miller's gaze swept over the cabin, the newly built chicken coop, and the garden plot Jane had been working on. "You seem to be doing well for a widow with no visible means of support." The implication was clear, and Jane felt her face flush with anger. "My husband left me some savings," she lied, "and I take in mending." Miller nodded, clearly not believing her. "Of course. Well, good day, Mrs. Jenkins." He mounted his horse and tipped his hat. "Remember what I said about Morgan. He's not the hero you think he is." After Miller left, Jane sank down onto a stump, her mind racing. Where was Flynn? Was he in trouble? And why would Miller come all this way to look for him? That night, after Samuel was asleep, Jane sat by the fire with her mother's blanket wrapped around her shoulders, the same blanket Flynn had paid $20 for and then returned to her. The gesture that had started everything. A soft knock at the door startled her. Jane grabbed the rifle Thomas had taught her to use and approached cautiously. "Who's there?" "It's me, Jane." Flynn's voice sent relief flooding through her. She quickly unbolted the door and pulled it open. Flynn stood there, his clothes dirty and torn, a dark bruise blooming on his cheekbone. "My God, what happened to you?" Jane whispered, pulling him inside and bolting the door again. Flynn sagged against the wall, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. "Miller's men caught up with me near the pass. I managed to get away. But they're not far behind." Jane led him to a chair by the fire. "Miller was here earlier, looking for you. He said you stole a horse." Flynn's laugh was bitter. "That horse is mine, bought and paid for. Miller's just angry because I know too much about his dealings. He's been selling off cattle that don't belong to him and pocketing the money." Jane dampened a cloth and gently cleaned the cut on Flynn's cheek. "Why didn't you go to the sheriff?" "Miller's got the sheriff in his pocket." Flynn winced as Jane's cloth touched a tender spot. "Besides, it would be my word against his, and he's a Miller. I'm just a hired hand." Jane set the cloth aside, her fingers lingering on Flynn's face. "What will you do now?" Flynn caught her hand, holding it against his cheek. "I'm headed north, to Montana. I've got a friend there who runs a ranch. He's been asking me to come work for him for years." The thought of Flynn leaving sent a wave of desolation through Jane. "When?" "Tonight, as soon as my horse is rested." His eyes held hers. "I came to say goodbye." Jane pulled her hand away, turning so he wouldn't see the tears gathering in her eyes. "I see." Flynn stood, moving to stand behind her. "Jane, I wish things were different. I wish I could stay." "Then stay," Jane whispered, not turning around. "We could testify for you, Samuel and I." Flynn gently turned her to face him. "And put you both in danger? Miller's not a man to cross, Jane. He'd make your life hell just to get at me." Jane knew he was right, but that didn't ease the ache in her chest. "We'll miss you." Flynn's hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch infinitely gentle. "I'll miss you both more than you know." The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken feelings. Jane found herself leaning into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. "Jane," Flynn's voice was rough with emotion, "I never meant for this to happen. When I saw you in that store with your blanket, I just wanted to help. I didn't expect—" "What?" Jane whispered, opening her eyes to find his face closer than before. "I didn't expect to fall in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable. Jane felt her heart swell with a joy so intense it was almost painful. "Flynn," she breathed, and then his lips were on hers, gentle at first, then with increasing urgency. Jane's arms slid around his neck, drawing him closer, pouring all her longing and fear into the kiss. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Flynn rested his forehead against hers. "Come with me," he said suddenly. "You and Samuel, come to Montana with me." Jane pulled back, startled. "What?" "Come with me," Flynn repeated, his eyes intense. "We can start fresh there, away from Miller, away from the memories. I've got enough saved to buy a small plot of land. It won't be much at first, but—" "Yes," Jane interrupted, surprising herself with the certainty she felt. "Yes, we'll come with you." Flynn's face transformed with joy, making him look younger, unburdened. He kissed her again, then pulled back with reluctance. "We need to leave tonight. Miller's men won't be far behind me." Jane nodded, her mind already racing ahead. "Give me an hour to pack what we need. I'll wake Samuel." As Flynn went to check on his horse, Jane moved through the cabin with quiet efficiency, gathering only what was essential clothes, a few small keepsakes, food for the journey. She woke Samuel gently, explaining in simple terms that they were going on an adventure with Mr. Flynn. "Are we coming back?" Samuel asked sleepily as Jane helped him dress. Jane hesitated. "No, sweetheart. We're going to a new home, far away." Samuel considered this, his small face serious. "Will there be fishing?" Jane smiled through her tears. "Yes, lots of fishing." By midnight, they were ready. Flynn had moved his horse deeper into the woods, away from the trail, and returned to help carry their belongings. Jane took one last look around the cabin that had been her home for 7 years, where she had been both happiest and most desolate. She tucked her mother's blanket around Samuel, who was already half asleep again, and closed the door behind them. They traveled through the night, keeping to the forest rather than the trails. Flynn carried Samuel, who dozed against his chest, while Jane walked beside them. her heart pounding with equal parts fear and exhilaration. By dawn, they had reached a small hunting cabin Flynn knew of, abandoned for the winter. "We'll rest here today," Flynn said, settling Samuel on a rough bunk. "Travel again at nightfall." Jane nodded, exhaustion catching up with her. She sat on the edge of the bunk beside her son, removing her boots with trembling hands. Flynn knelt before her, taking over the task. "You should sleep," he said softly. "I'll keep watch." Jane caught his hand. "You need rest too." Flynn smiled, the tender expression making her heart skip. "I'll rest, just not yet." As Jane lay down beside Samuel, pulling the precious blanket over both of them, she watched Flynn through half-closed eyes. He moved to the small window, rifle in hand, his profile strong against the growing light. In that moment, despite the danger and uncertainty, Jane knew she had made the right choice. She was halfway to sleep when a new thought jolted her awake. "Flynn, the chickens!" Flynn turned, a smile playing at his lips. "I let them loose before we left. They'll be fine." Jane relaxed again, comforted by this small kindness that was so typical of him. "Thank you." "Sleep, Jane," Flynn murmured. "We've got a long journey ahead." They traveled for 3 days, moving mostly at night, resting in hidden places during daylight hours. On the afternoon of the 4th day, Flynn announced they had crossed into Wyoming territory. "We should be safe to travel on the main roads now," he said, as they prepared to move again. "Miller's influence doesn't extend this far." The journey became easier after that. They purchased a small wagon and supplies in a town where no one knew them, using the money Flynn had saved. Samuel, who had been remarkably resilient throughout their flight, delighted in having his own space in the back of the wagon, where he could nap or play with the few toys Jane had packed. As they traveled north, the landscape changed, becoming more dramatic with towering mountains and vast prairies. Jane found herself falling in love with the wild beauty of it, so different from the forested hills of their former home. Flynn seemed to grow lighter with each mile, the tension that had been his constant companion easing away. He told stories of his time in Montana, of the clear mountain lakes and the summer wildflowers that carpeted the valleys. He spoke of his friend's ranch, of the small cabin available for them to use until they could build their own place. In the evenings after Samuel was asleep, Flynn and Jane would sit by the fire, planning their future. Sometimes they spoke of practical matters, what crops they might grow, how many cattle they could start with. Other times they spoke of more personal dreams, the kind of home they would build, the siblings they might give Samuel. On these nights their kisses grew more passionate, their touches more intimate, but Flynn always pulled back, his breath ragged. "Not until we're properly married," he would say, pressing his forehead to hers. "You deserve that much respect." Jane loved him all the more for his restraint, even as her body ached for more. They were a week into Wyoming when disaster struck. A spring storm blew in from the mountains, bringing freezing rain that quickly turned to heavy snow. They sought shelter in a small cave Flynn spotted near the trail, huddling together for warmth as the temperature plummeted. "Will we be stuck here long?" Samuel asked, his teeth chattering despite being wrapped in Jane's blanket. Flynn ruffled the boy's hair. "Just until the storm passes, partner. Then we'll be on our way again." But the storm didn't pass quickly. For 2 days, the snow fell steadily, piling up outside the cave entrance. Their food supplies dwindled, and the cold seeped into their bones despite the small fire Flynn managed to keep going. On the 3rd morning, Flynn announced he was going hunting. "We need fresh meat," he said, checking his rifle, "and I need to see how bad the snow is on the trail." Jane watched him go with trepidation. Samuel pressed against her side. "He'll come back, won't he, Mama?" "Of course he will," Jane assured him, praying she was right. The hours crawled by. Jane told Samuel stories to distract him, taught him counting games, anything to keep their minds off the cold and Flynn's absence. By late afternoon, with no sign of Flynn, Jane's worry had turned to fear. "Stay here," she told Samuel firmly. "I'm going to look for Mr. Flynn. Don't leave the cave, understand?" Samuel nodded solemnly. Jane wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders and ventured into the snow. The world outside was eerily silent, the landscape transformed into something alien and hostile. Jane called Flynn's name, the sound swallowed by the thick blanket of white. She had gone perhaps a quarter-mile from the cave when she spotted something dark against the snow. Moving closer, her heart nearly stopped. It was Flynn, lying motionless, a thin layer of snow already covering his body. "Flynn!" Jane rushed to him, falling to her knees. He was breathing, but his skin was alarmingly cold. Beside him lay a small deer he had evidently shot before collapsing. Jane shook him gently. "Flynn, wake up. Please wake up." Flynn's eyelids fluttered, then opened. "Jane?" His voice was weak. "What are you doing out here?" "Looking for you," Jane said, relief making her voice shake. "Can you stand? We need to get you back to the cave." Flynn tried to push himself up, but fell back with a groan. "My ankle. I think it's broken. I was tracking the deer and stepped in a hole hidden by the snow." Jane looked around desperately. The cave was too far to drag him, and the temperature was dropping as evening approached. Then she remembered the blanket, her mother's blanket, that had started everything. "Wait here," she said. "I'm going back for Samuel and the blanket. We'll keep you warm until you can move." Flynn caught her hand. "Jane, it's too dangerous. The temperature will drop even more after dark." "I'm not leaving you out here to freeze," Jane said firmly. "I'll be back as quickly as I can." Jane raced back to the cave, her lungs burning with the cold air. She found Samuel where she'd left him, his eyes wide with worry. "Mama, you're back." "Samuel, I need your help," Jane said, grabbing the blanket and a small flask of whiskey Flynn kept for medicinal purposes. "Mr. Flynn is hurt. We need to help him." Samuel nodded bravely, pulling on his coat. Together, they made their way back to where Flynn lay, now shivering violently. Jane knelt beside him, uncorking the flask. "Drink this. It will warm you from the inside." Flynn took a swig of the whiskey, coughing as it burned down his throat. Jane unfolded the blanket and wrapped it around him, then lay down beside him, pulling Samuel close on Flynn's other side. "What are you doing?" Flynn asked through chattering teeth. "Keeping you warm," Jane said, pressing her body against his. "Our body heat will help." They lay there as darkness fell, the three of them huddled together under the blanket. Jane whispered encouragement to Flynn, telling him stories, making plans for their future, anything to keep him conscious. Samuel fell asleep eventually, his small body providing additional warmth. As the night deepened, Jane feared they might all freeze to death, but she kept talking, kept Flynn engaged. "Remember the first time you came to our cabin?" she murmured. "Samuel asked if you were a real cowboy." Flynn's lips, blue with cold, curved in a slight smile. "He's a good boy. You've raised him well." "We're going to raise him together," Jane insisted, "along with any brothers or sisters that come along." Flynn's arm tightened around her. "I'd like that," he whispered. "A house full of children with your spirit." They talked through the night, their voices growing weaker as the cold seeped through the blanket. Jane began to drift in and out of consciousness, her thoughts becoming disjointed. She dreamed of warmth, of summer sun on her face, of Flynn's arms around her in a proper bed. A shout jolted her awake. Morning light filtered through the trees, and figures were approaching through the snowmen on horseback. "Over here," one called. "I see something." Jane struggled to sit up, her limbs stiff with cold. Flynn was unconscious beside her, his breathing shallow. Samuel stirred, whimpering with cold. The men reached them quickly, 4 riders bundled in heavy coats. The leader dismounted, his bearded face concerned. "Madam, are you all right?" My husband," Jane stammered, the lie coming easily. "He's hurt, his ankle." The men worked quickly, lifting Flynn onto one of the horses. Another rider took Samuel, wrapping him in a fresh blanket. The leader helped Jane onto his own horse, his manner respectful. "We're from the Peterson Ranch," he explained as they rode. "Out looking for strays after the storm. Lucky we found you?" "Very lucky," Jane agreed, her eyes fixed on Flynn's still form ahead of them. The Peterson Ranch was a substantial operation, with a main house and several outbuildings. They were taken directly to the house, where a stern-faced woman with kind eyes took charge. "Get the doctor," she ordered one of the men, then turned to Jane. "I'm Martha Peterson. Let's get you all warmed up." The next few hours passed in a blur. Jane and Samuel were given hot baths, warm clothes, and food. Flynn was taken to a bedroom, where the local doctor set his broken ankle and treated him for frostbite on his fingers and toes. "He'll keep all his digits," the doctor assured Jane. "But it was a close call. Another few hours out there." He left the sentence unfinished. Jane sat by Flynn's bedside while he slept. Samuel curled up in a chair nearby. Martha Peterson brought her tea and sat with her for a while. "Your husband is a lucky man," she said, watching Jane smooth Flynn's hair back from his forehead. Jane didn't correct the assumption. "I'm the lucky one," she said softly. Martha patted her hand. "You rest too. You've been through an ordeal." Flynn woke the next morning, his eyes finding Jane immediately. "You saved my life," he said, his voice hoarse. Jane shook her head. "The blanket saved your life, the one you bought and gave back to me." Flynn's smile was weak but genuine. Maybe it was fate then. They stayed at the Peterson ranch for 2 weeks while Flynn's ankle began to heal. Mr. Peterson, a gruff but fair man, offered Flynn work once he was recovered, managing a smaller property the Petersons owned about 10 miles away. "It's got a decent house on it," Peterson explained. "Nothing fancy, but solid. Good land for raising cattle and horses. Been looking for the right man to run it for a while now." Flynn looked to Jane, the question in his eyes. Jane nodded, a smile spreading across her face. This was better than they had hoped for a home of their own, honest work, and no need to run any further. The day before they were to leave for their new home, Flynn asked Mr. Peterson for the use of his buggy. "There's something I need to do in town," he explained, his eyes twinkling with a secret. He returned late in the afternoon, a small package tucked inside his coat. After supper, when Samuel had been put to bed, Flynn took Jane's hand and led her to the porch. The spring night was cool but clear, stars spangling the vast Wyoming sky. Flynn seemed nervous, shifting his weight from his good foot to his injured one and back again. "Jane," he began, then stopped, clearing his throat. "I'm not good with words, never have been, but I want to do this right." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside was a simple gold band. "I want to marry you, Jane, properly in a church with vows and witnesses. I want to be a father to Samuel and any other children we might have. I want to build a life with you." Jane felt tears fill her eyes. "Yes," she whispered, "yes to all of it." Flynn slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms, his kiss conveying all the emotion his words couldn't express. They stood on the porch for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, making plans and promises for their future. The wedding took place a month later in the small church in the nearest town. Samuel stood proudly beside Flynn, holding the rings on a small pillow Martha Peterson had sewn for the occasion. Jane wore a new dress, the first she'd had in years, and carried wildflowers Flynn had picked that morning. The ceremony was simple but deeply meaningful. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Flynn kissed Jane with such tenderness that several of the women in attendance dabbed at their eyes. "Mrs. Morgan," Flynn whispered against her lips. At last. Their new home was everything Mr. Peterson had promised, a solid 2-story house with a wide porch, surrounded by good grazing land, and with a creek running through the property. Flynn's friend from Montana sent a wedding gift of 10 prime breeding cattle, giving them a start on their own herd. Jane planted a garden larger than she'd ever had before, and Flynn built a proper coop for a new flock of chickens. Samuel started school in the fall, riding his own pony that Flynn had trained specially for him. By their first anniversary, Jane was expecting their first child together. Flynn's pride and joy were evident in every tender glance, every gentle touch to her growing belly. He had recovered fully from his injuries, though he walked with a slight limp in cold weather, a small price to pay, he always said, for the life they had found together. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Samuel playing with the puppy Flynn had brought home the week before, Jane spread her mother's blanket across their laps. It was showing signs of wear now, but she had carefully mended each frayed edge, each loosened thread. "Do you ever think about how different our lives would be if you hadn't bought this blanket that day?" she asked, leaning her head against Flynn's shoulder. Flynn's arm tightened around her. "I try not to think about what might have been, only what is and what will be." Jane placed his hand on her rounded belly, where their child kicked vigorously. "And what will be is beautiful." Flynn kissed her temple. "It already is." As darkness fell and the first stars appeared, they remained on the porch. wrapped in the blanket and in each other's arms, the warmth between them keeping the night's chill at bay just as it always would, through all the seasons of their lives together. Years passed, and the Morgan Ranch flourished. Flynn and Jane welcomed a daughter they named Emma, who had her mother's auburn hair and her father's dark eyes. 2 years later, a son joined the family, Liam, who grew to be the spitting image of his father. Samuel, now a young man of 16, had grown tall and strong, with a natural gift for working with horses that made Flynn burst with pride. He had Flynn's last name now. Having asked to be officially adopted on his 10th birthday, a request that had brought tears to Flynn's eyes. The house had expanded along with the family, with Flynn adding rooms as needed. Jane's garden had grown into a small orchard, providing fruit for the preserves she sold in town for extra income. They had a good life, filled with hard work, but also much joy. On the 15th anniversary of the day Flynn had bought Jane's blanket, they held a special celebration. Friends and neighbors gathered at the ranch for a feast and dancing, children running everywhere, laughter filling the air. As the evening wound down, Flynn found Jane standing on the porch, watching the sunset. He slipped his arms around her waist from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Happy anniversary, Mrs. Morgan," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her neck. Jane turned in his arms, her face as beautiful to him now as it had been that first day in the trading post. 15 years, she marveled. It seems impossible. "The best 15 years of my life," Flynn said honestly. From a nearby table, Jane picked up a carefully wrapped package. "I have something for you." Flynn unwrapped it to find a quilt, lovingly pieced together from squares of fabric, each one representing a memory from their life together. In the center was a square made from her mother's blanket, the blanket that had started everything. "Jane," Flynn breathed, running his fingers over the fine stitching. "It's beautiful." "I wanted to preserve it," Jane explained, "so our grandchildren and their grandchildren will know our story." Flynn cupped her face in his hands. "Our story is just beginning, Jane. We have many more chapters to write." As they stood there, the quilt draped over their shoulders, Flynn thought of how far they had come from that cold day in the trading post. From a desperate widow and a lonely cowboy to the strong family they were now, all because of a blanket, a chance encounter, and the courage to reach for happiness when it presented itself. "I love you, Jane Morgan," Flynn whispered, his voice rough with emotion, more with each passing day. Jane's eyes shone with the same love, the same certainty. "And I love you, Flynn Morgan, today, tomorrow, and for all the days to come." As the stars began to appear in the Wyoming sky, they stood wrapped in the quilt of their memories, looking forward to all the memories yet, to be made secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges life might bring, they would face them together, wrapped in each other's arms, just as they had been from the very beginning.